hello to you both. You can't see me, but you know what I look like already, so you don't need to go through that again. I see you're wearing an archival T-shirt. That's very impressive. Oh my God, that's a 10-year-old T-shirt. Um, so, okay, so our what you call Just Health Data Labs headliners for tonight. So we got on our left Aram Sinnreich and Jesse Gilbert on the right. I first actually came across Aram about 12 or 13 years ago. I was assigning readings from his books when I was a professor of music industry innovation at a UK university. And when we first did MTF Labs in Cambridge, MA, at Microsoft Research with Harvard and MIT and Berkeley, Aram was one of the co-authors. I mean, he was there in his capacity as a smart person who thinks about these things, but also one of the co-authors of our Manifesto for the Future of Music Technology Research, shortened to the Music Techie Festo. But I will basically buy and read anything that Aram writes. I didn't know Jesse until very recently, and he comes very highly recommended by Aram, such that Aram wrote the book that we're going to be talking about today, which I have a copy here. This might be the first digital book signing, which would be a clever trick if we can pull that off. But one single Zoom call with the pair of them recently, in a lead up to this, I understood why this was a very good pairing for an authorship. But the book that they've written, The Secret Life of Data, subtitled Navigating Hype and Uncertainty in the Age of Algorithmic Surveillance, it's on MIT Press. I'm going to let them introduce it to you. And then we're going to have a sort of a live podcast interview, which we're actually going to record and release as a podcast. And we're going to do that in front of a live audience, which is always a fun thing to do. But gentlemen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. So we're going to start out by reading the first 4 pages of the introduction of the book, which hopefully does its job and introduces the core themes of the book. And then we'll have a lively conversation with you that's 100% unrehearsed and could go anywhere.
Go for your life.
Hello, and I'm gonna begin reading the introduction. Thank you for having us. We're happy to be here. In 2018, the violent criminal who had terrorized California residents for over a decade was finally brought to justice more than 30 years after his last known crime. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer, was arrested by Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies and charged with a dozen murders attributed to an elusive figure previously known only as the Golden State Killer. After troves of genetic evidence were presented at his trial, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was sent to prison for the remainder of his natural life. According to news coverage at the time of DeAngelo's arrest, the long cold case had finally been cracked thanks to technological advances. Old DNA samples were analyzed using modern genetic profiling techniques, and the results uploaded to an open-source genealogy website called GEDmatch, where investigators homed in on the killer's identity by tracing his family tree through profiles posted by other users on the site. Data was hailed as the hero in this case. Without the invisible strands of ones and zeros strung between our bodies, our identities, our markets, and our law enforcement system, justice would never have been served and the Golden State Killer would have remained at large. Even if genealogy websites weren't built for the purpose of aiding in criminal justice, outcomes like this have been trumpeted as examples of how new methods of data collection, storage, and analysis could make the world a better place by bringing clarity and accountability to antiquated systems hindered by guesswork, bias, and obscurity. It is fitting that today is National DNA Day, District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert said at a press conference announcing the arrest on April 25th, 2018. We found the needle in the haystack. Yet, while many rejoiced at DeAngelo's capture and conviction, not everyone found comfort in the investigators' methods. As soon as the news broke, technology ethicists and civil rights advocates began to raise concerns about the broader implications of using ancestry databases to track suspected criminals. Should law enforcement have free rein to use DNA matching techniques in all cases, even those involving nonviolent crimes? Without advanced regulatory and judicial oversight, could techniques like this be used in a sloppy or even malicious fashion, potentially implicating blameless suspects? Should users of open source databases like GED Match be informed that their contributions might unwittingly make them, quote, genetic informants on their innocent family, as attorney Stephen Mercer of Maryland Public Defender's Office framed it in the USA Today interview? The legal and ethical waters became even muddier in 2020 when a Los Angeles Times investigation revealed that the official story about DeAngelo's identification and capture had omitted some important details. For one thing, law enforcement investigators didn't collect data only from the open source GED Match site. They also obtained data using a fake account on the private genealogy service Family Tree DNA, a potential violation of the company's terms of service. Additionally, police collaborated with a civilian geneticist who used her personal account on another private service, MyHeritage, to upload DeAngelo's DNA and explore his family tree without notifying the company of her true intentions. None of this data collection and analysis was undertaken with a warrant, which means that, contrary to the pledges they'd made to their customers, Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage shared personal genetic information with police, even when they weren't required to by law. Despite these revelations, many people still believed the benefits of this foray into an ethical gray area were worth the risks. As the daughter of one of DeAngelo's victims told the LA Times, she didn't mind that practices were banned because the unmasking of the killer justified any potential violation of privacy, and the truth is what's important.
Less than 2 years later, another breaking news story raised the stakes even further, leading many people to reevaluate the relative merits of truth and privacy. In 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Dobbs v. Jackson, effectively ending half a century of safe and legal abortions throughout the United States, and opening the door for numerous state laws that not only outlawed abortions, but treated women who sought them as murderers. Privacy advocates and supporters of abortion rights immediately began to raise the alarm about the risks of online data exposing abortion seekers to liability under these new laws. Simultaneously, many news outlets and nonprofit organizations began public awareness campaigns aimed at showing abortion seekers how to protect their digital footprints and thereby minimize their potential exposure to law enforcement. These concerns were not mere speculation or hyperbole. Even prior to the Dobbs decision, there were dozens of cases in the United States in which people's online search histories, chat archives, and other digital traces were used to prosecute them for terminating pregnancies. And even more such cases elsewhere around the world, especially in countries where abortion is not legal. In the wake of Dobbs, civil rights watchdogs began to look more closely at a newer set of risks for digital exposure: women's health tracking apps and biometric devices, such as menstrual calendars and smartwatches. The same constellation of biotechnology, digital databases, identity tracking business models, and evolving norms about privacy that had led to the Golden State Killer's arrest now threaten to expose millions of American women to prosecution for seeking a form of medical intervention they'd understood as a fundamental right throughout their entire lives. The tensions inherent in these two recent news events between public and private, physical and digital, legal and ethical, are at the heart of our book. Together, they exemplify the double-edged sword of life in the 21st century, a potent mixture of possibilities and perils emerging in a data-rich, globally connected society. Armed with smartwatches, home internet appliances, and an endless supply of apps, games, and streaming services, billions of us now live and spend our days and nights enmeshed in webs of digital sensors, machine learning algorithms, and overlapping information networks, all designed to reduce the minutiae of our lives into discrete data points. These data are then transmitted, stored, and analyzed for the purposes of predicting, evaluating, and influencing our behaviors in a never-ending feedback loop. While these new data systems have likely improved our lives in countless ways, many of which I'm sure have been discussed at this event today, they've also presented us with a host of new conflicts and conundrums that we still lack the ability or even the conceptual language to resolve. How can a MyHeritage user be expected to anticipate the risk that they may become a genetic informant on a distant unknown relative simply by submitting their own DNA to explore their family tree? How can a judge issue a warrant allowing police to investigate an individual suspect in a database for a specific crime without exposing all of the other people listed in the database to unwarranted surveillance? How can a technology user confidently wear a smartwatch or install a health tracking app when a future court decision might turn their digital medical records into evidence against them? These are just a few of the many analogous challenges we explore in this book. Though they encompass a broad range of settings, contexts, technologies, and cultures, what unites them is a phenomenon that we refer to as the secret life of data. The basic premise is simple, though its implications are complex. There is no limit to the amount and variety of data, and ultimately knowledge, that may be produced from an object, event, or interaction given enough time, distance, and computational power. In even plainer language, it means that whatever we think we're sharing when we upload a selfie, write an email, shop online, stream a video, look up driving directions, track our sleep, like a post, write a book, or spit into a test tube, that's only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Both the artifacts we produce intentionally and the data traces we leave in our wake as we go about our daily lives can, and likely will, be recorded, archived, analyzed, combined, and cross-referenced with other data and used to generate new forms of knowledge without our awareness or consent. This may be done not just once, but over and over by individuals and institutions we've never heard of, using techniques that may not even have been invented yet, as technology and society continue to co-evolve over time. All of this adds up to something greater than the sum of its parts. Billions of us now live in a globally connected world, and our social structures and personal relationships reflect this fact in innumerable ways. This means every time any of us creates or collects a piece of data, even through casual interactions with everyday technologies, we have a responsibility to consider how the information derived from it might affect our friends, our colleagues, our compatriots, and billions of people we've never even met. To borrow a phrase from a popular 20th century bumper sticker, we need to think globally whenever we act locally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction to the book. A round of applause. And now, for the sake of what is now the podcast, I'm going to pretend we didn't hear any of that for two reasons. One is potentially for copyright complications. We're not going to include your reading in the podcast, but also because we always start with who are you and what do you do? Jesse, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Jesse Gilbert. I live in Los Angeles. I have for the last 24 years. I am an artist and researcher working kind of at the interdisciplinary intersection of a number of different threads. I have a background in music. I ended up working in the film department at CalArts for almost 10 years and kind of got exposed to all of the digital media workflows there. I am a lifelong programmer, started in the late 70s programming, so I have a technology practice, and so I've kind of skirt some of the academic worlds. I've left academia in 2017. I have run my own business. I work in immersive media and also have a long-standing interest in critical theory, and I've been working with Aram over many years to develop some of those, and been a long-term conversation from the lens of practice, but also thinking really conceptually about kind of what is going on in the industry and the changes that are underway. Have a background in research and looking at technology and education. So kind of a lot of parallel strands that are intersecting in this book and in this ongoing dialogue that Aram and I have had over many decades on the topic.
Fantastic. Aram.
I'm Aram Sinnreich. I'm a professor of communication studies at American University in Washington, D.C. I write books and articles based on scholarship about the intersection of law, technology, and culture. I'm also a professional musician, and I write science fiction as a side hustle. Probably most impressively, I've been friends with Jesse Gilbert since 1986, when we met on the first day of public science and math high school in New York City, where we both grew up.
Fantastic. Well, you've kind of touched on this a little, but I want to sort of ask the question to see if there is a sort of a deeper answer to this, because it's very clear to me why this book exists. Why is it you that wrote it?
Well, as Jesse said, this really grew out of an ongoing conversation we've been having as long as we've known each other. One of the things that brought us together as friends was this kind of nascent intuitive interest in how the cultural effects of new technologies would have unexpected ramifications for social power. One of the things we both left out of our capsule bios is that we've both been politically active since we were teenagers. And in fact, we belonged to a youth political activism group together in New York City in the 1980s, whose alums have gone on to do some very interesting things in law and policy and cultural interventions. So more proximately, about 6 years ago, shortly before COVID, Jesse and I co-authored a theory building article for the International Journal of Communication, where we coined a theory called the carrier wave principle. And it was basically what we've now distilled into The Secret Life of Data, but it was written for our fellow scholars and policy-facing academics. And its basic principle was that that we're spending too much time and energy worrying about the first-order consequences of data extractive industries and law enforcement and governmental practice, and not thinking enough about the long-term consequences of data collection, because of course data have no expiration date, and in fact they grow in power and value over time, geometrically, as they're combined with other data and as new forensic techniques and new cultural perspectives emerge to squeeze more water from the stone. So so we wrote this article, and we presented it to a bunch of different academic audiences, and all of whom were very gave us fantastic feedback and allowed us to think about different kind of theoretical interventions that the carrier wave principle can make. But we began to get very frustrated that partially for our fault for writing it in academese, this was not likely to influence actual technology builders or policymakers or artists or everyday people who have to navigate their data saturated lives in this new environment without any kind of ethical, legal, or even cultural guideposts to make it all make sense for them. So we pitched it as a kind of popular trade book to MIT Press, because they've got widespread distribution through Penguin Random House, and fortunately they went for it, and we spent the kind of darkest year and a half of the COVID pandemic collaborating at a remove of 3,000 miles on the manuscript.
Fantastic. So you had an imagined audience, not of academics necessarily, but technology builders, you mentioned. Is that who you had in mind when you wrote this?
So the book is actually written in a style that I think we hope will be accessible to anyone who has an interest in the field. I think we've intentionally tried to unwind some pretty complex subjects in a straightforward manner, and I think it's reflects kind of our belief system, really, that this conversation has been dominated for far too long by technocrats and people who are comfortable speaking in acronyms and coded language to discuss things that are by now have implications in everyone's lives. And really the goal of the book, I think, is to broaden that conversation, to try to do some cross silo thinking, to interview dozens of experts across a variety of fields, to incorporate their insights and to reflect on what they are saying and also what they're not saying. What kinds of languages and conceptual formations are really shaping the discourse in these connected but apparently not in dialogue fields. And I think that this is the thing that you can do in a book. Now that we've been talking about this book for several months and presenting this, I think we're going through a reflection process as well. That really, this is kind of also connective tissue. We're trying to theorize that where do these connections happen, and how do we get more people involved in the conversation that have a diversity of interests, of life experiences, who can reflect on them and apply some common sense thinking to topics that have traditionally really been exclusionary in sort of the way they're formed. And I think that, again, this seems more and more critical now that as we are sort of thinking through not only how previous paradigms are expressed in the computing landscape, but also how that landscape has scaled to affect every corner of the globe, to a degree that I don't think, 20, even 30 years ago, we would ever have really predicted would have been possible. The notion of a ubiquitous computing environment was a pipe dream, that was, discussed in places like the MIT Media Lab, but it really wasn't a reality. And I think that we're approaching that now to the extent that, we really can't turn this experiment off. There's no going back to basic principles here. We have to figure out what to do now.
Right. I want to talk about personal data, particularly, because that is something that people are very concerned about. Not specifically data in the broad sense, but my health data, my heart rate, brainwave measurements, height, weight, skin color, family history of mental illness. To what extent is that data mine in a meaningful way?
Well, the very language that you use to ask the question, I think, excludes a lot of the power dynamics and social consequences of the kind of personal data that you're describing. To frame it in a purely kind of propertistic paradigm is to already relinquish what in a European context, with intellectual property, is often referred to as the kind of droit moral, the kind of moral dimension of a relationship between an author and their work. And, to consign data to the realm of property is to begin with the premise that it is something to be commoditized, extracted, commoditized, exchanged, and monetized, which is, of course, what's happening on a massive scale all around the globe right now. But that it also precludes certain relationships to data that may be vital to preserving human dignity in a data-saturated network society. It's not as though you owning your genetic information or your biomedical records is going to stave off a lot of the kind of consequences we discuss in our book. And part of that is because, of course, data only need to be transacted or collected or stored once in order for them to have multiple afterlives, whether through breaches or through transactions or through government fiat or through any number of mechanisms. Once those data are out of their siloed containers, they'll never return. And they'll be recombined with other data about you that you might not know exists by third parties that you've never interacted with to derive intelligence that could be used to make massive decisions about your life and the lives of the people around you. So the short answer to your very simple on the surface question is you not only don't you own your data, you can't own your data. And any regulatory regime that suggests that you can and that therefore it's safe to extract and store is a pipe dream and does a disservice to human society.
Okay,
but I think it's important to say that answer, which I agree with in large part, presupposes that the current sort of ethical, moral, and legal environment surrounding the use of data is going to persist, right? So what Aram is really acknowledging is probably with the caveat, under the current conditions, it's a pipe dream. But I do think that it's a conversation worth having, and it's a conversation that we should probably get into a lively discussion about it in this talk, because the idea is here that it's possible to draw boundaries around data when what we're really talking about is a kind of transformation of data into actionable information in whatever context it is being used in. That's the crux of the argument here is, while the title of the book is The Secret Life of Data, we're really talking about the contextual derivation of information and triangulation with other data sets for unpredictable uses. And I think that we could get into a debate about whether or not we can always account for this kind of nth order set of possibilities around the uses of data, which would be interesting to have. But I do think that there is a kind of establishment of a set of ground truths in terms of the largely unregulated uses of data, particularly in the United States, that our argument is kind of fundamentally grounded there.
Right.
Right. We're not saying that regulation is unnecessary or toothless. We're saying it has to be part of a much larger ecological approach to managing the role of data in human society. And even, it's hard to talk about, even after having written this book and talked about this book for a couple of months, without using language that, like your question, Andrew, your excellent question, contains within it some seeds of ideology, right? So, even when we discuss like what does the secret life of data mean for people, we tend to talk about it in terms of, it's about all the kind of unexpected downstream consequences of the data that we collect today, like what might happen to it tomorrow or next year or a century from now. But part of what we demonstrate in our book is that the whole metaphor of upstream, downstream doesn't actually apply to data, because yes, the typical flow is that it gets collected, stored, analyzed, cross-referenced, turned into information, ultimately into intelligence and knowledge. The reverse is true as well, right? I mean, there are countless examples, one of which is the fact that it took only about a year after the generative AI image generator DALL-E was rolled out to the public for computer scientists to reverse engineer its algorithm and identify the images that had been used in its machine learning training data. That's not supposed to happen, but that's the rule, not the exception.
It sounds like in abstract terms, you're saying there is an otherwise it could be. Do you have an image of what that might look like, or how you would describe like a better environment for our data, or for data themselves?
Well, I mean, so again, I think that we have a bunch of collected recommendations and examples of what we consider to be sort of best practices in the book regarding the handling and storage of data, effective policies, inclusion of multivocal perspectives on the uses of data, and participatory design, looking at involving the people who are most directly impacted by decisions made about data. But I think that there's also a conceptual issue that we're touching on here, and that conceptual issue has a number of strands that we can discuss at length. One of them, I think, that we sort of teased out from the book is that we're really looking at some a significant shift into what Aram was just alluding to. It's kind of the forensic mindset, the dominance of a forensic mindset in the, we talk about data mining, we talk about business intelligence, we talk about actionable inference, we talk about, artificial intelligence, with its own stochastic understanding of new phenomena that it is encountering. But I think that what we have to acknowledge is that in large part, even when we're talking about collective action, open source intelligence movement, the collective action that we might hail as kind of an alternative to some of these more, commercially driven or state surveillance type applications, we are all adopting in many ways a kind of forensic approach to the world in a certain sense, and some of that is positive, right? Like some of that we could argue there are advances, for example, in holding people accountable, holding states accountable. We talk about the impact on journalism, the impact on legal action, the impact on the sciences, with the citizen science movements and participatory movements. There are a lot of things here that, again, we are not trying to paint a picture of there being some sort of monolithically negative applications of this new environment that we're in. It's really that I think we have to identify and try to mitigate the most egregious harms, and we need to involve more people in that process of identifying what those are, and then as a society having a collective conversation about what our values are in relation to these challenges.
And so, just to build on what Jesse's saying, the kind of spirit of pluralism and multivocality runs through our book, both in the critiques of the current approaches to data governance and in a lot of our kind of ameliorative approaches to using data more wisely to achieve a greater degree of human agency and dignity. We really break it down very systematically in the second half of the book in terms of what kinds of interventions we can imagine. And we also acknowledge that even having interviewed dozens of experts for the book, and including their voices on the page, we're just two people. This has to be a bigger, we're not going to deliver you a silver bullet. This needs to be a global conversation about how to address these challenges. But you can think of it structurally in terms of a couple of key pressure points, right? So regulation is one important pressure point. Over in the EU, you've been a little more forward thinking and had greater political comity to achieve that. I'm not sure that's going to be true anymore after what's happening in the EU at the moment, but good on you for getting that stuff in there. From a technological standpoint, part of what we critique is the kind of logic of more is better that gets built into all of our devices. Just because you can cram microphones and cameras and other kinds of sensors into every networked object and turn them on by default 24/7, 365 doesn't mean you should. And the marketing and, more importantly, the kind of design of technological appliances and systems needs to get more sophisticated and to center the most vulnerable imagined end users in the design process. And then from a cultural and ethical standpoint, there are a lot of beautiful examples we cite in the book, but what it all really adds up to is what Jesse and I have been calling recently data kindness. This notion that, when we serve someone food, or we invite someone to our home, or when we stop our cars at the corner so people can cross the street, we have these well-established principles and practices that allow us to include consideration of other people and their needs and desires and values in our daily actions. And we don't yet have that as regards to data. So even the most politically principled, touchy-feely, sensitive people in the world will, leave an Alexa on in their house when someone comes over and not give any consideration or voice to the fact that it's going to be recording their conversations. So changing those kinds of practices and including acknowledging the role of data in our interpersonal and cultural exchanges, and thinking about what kindness means in that context is, I think, a really important and under-recognized ingredient in building a better future.
It sounds like what you're saying, and I don't think this is what you're saying, but it does sound like what you're saying is that these are behavioral responses to a technological problem. Is that even close to what you're describing?
I mean, certainly we do need to talk about decision making and behaviors, but I think it's far beyond that. And again, I think that, when I say that, a good example here would be, there are really no black and white answers to this question, right? We're in a gray area with regard to the ways that technology is pushing forward without adequate sort of moral and ethical frameworks, either within the companies and states that are initiating these projects, and with the general population that's trying to make sense of this, right? So a good example of this would be genealogy databases, which we cited in the introduction, where if you think of those as effectively informational networks, right? That people who are not active participants in those databases, even have studiously avoided them, will be implicated and will eventually participate in them via the participation of anyone that they might be related to, right? That there's a kind of bigger picture of these implications of the existence of such databases. We could look at the capture of the Golden State Killer as a positive example, and laud the uses of those databases, even if we might show some sidebar concerns about the privacy and ethical violations that went into the actual methods of capturing this person, right? But we might decide collectively as a society that it was worth capturing a serial killer. But there are other less obvious and a little more on a personal scale questions that we need to grapple with, and we cover one of them in the book, which is someone who found out that he was the father of an unknown child, a child that he did not know about previously. And we sort of we interviewed his daughter, who described the process of this uncovering of this information. This gentleman was a devout Catholic. He had fathered a child out of wedlock. This was a major blow to his self-conception and something he found incredibly embarrassing. He also, I think, she also acknowledged the clear rights of the person who was trying to find his biological family and discover something about his personal history that we can balance these two cases here, right? The right of privacy of the person who didn't even participate in this technological regime, and the right of the person seeking the information. They do not cancel each other out. The technology which is available, which we can all participate in, right? Are we regulating the participation of the quote behavior here? Are we deciding that these databases should not exist? Well, I don't think that for many people that would be an adequate solution. But how do we acknowledge here that the technology has pushed beyond even the sort of conceptual language that we have to balance these needs? And this is the situation we are finding ourselves in across the board, right? In across many different industries that, again, as Aram said, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. How do we balance this, and how do we get more people involved in this conversation so that that conversation isn't just being had inside a boardroom of a company seeking to capitalize on a new business model, or a state actor who is trying to consolidate power, but that it is an acknowledgement that this affects everyone in the society, even if we are not participating, right? And we could make that same argument with respect to sort of the deployment of mass surveillance, facial recognition technologies, many parallel tracks, the widespread use of biometric sensing. There are clear first order use cases that motivate us to do this, but we need to start thinking about the bigger picture and how this affects down the line and in unpredictable ways. And we need more people involved and speaking truth to power in those moments when we are actually getting to the point of deploying this at the scale that we are now undertaking.
So just to address Andrew's question on at its root, does this begin with technology and end with behavior? No. There is no alpha and no omega. Technology and culture and regulatory systems like laws and policies are all intermeshed with one another, and there's no beginning and no ending, which is why any approach to understanding the challenges or mitigating their effects have to be ecological and systemic in nature. And a lot of the examples we describe in the book don't begin with the technology. There's been a lot of work done by great scholars on subjects like digital redlining or algorithmic bias, where long-standing forms of oppression throughout our social systems gets not only institutionalized but amplified through the adoption of these technologies. But ironically, even though they are more pronounced, they're less addressable, because a lot of that amplification takes place within the black box of a commercially owned algorithm, and because the broader rationale that algorithms are just math and statistics are just math, and therefore they can't lie and they're neither good nor bad, paper over a multitude of sins by actual human beings who are either unwilling to acknowledge the potential social ramifications of their technologies, or actively have an interest in exploiting those social ramifications.
Okay, so we're in Europe, in the socialist utopia of Sweden, and we are interested in acronyms here in Europe. So when we speak about data, we speak about fair data, and that doesn't have anything to do with what you and I would understand as fairness, but it's about being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now we're pairing that with just data practices, just being judicious, unbiased, safe, and transparent. And that's about an aim for the users of data and the owners of data to annotate in such a way that it mitigates against the negative implications of data use, particularly in things like AI training, and especially in the context of healthcare. Is it too late? Should we bother? Is it too small a thing to do to annotate now data that are going into these systems that are already monoliths?
No. No. There are all kinds of ways, many of which I'm sure you've discussed throughout this event, of organizing data systems and devices in a way that that can potentially mitigate unexpected or socially consequential downstream effects. And some of that is rooted in issues like transparency. Like, never roll out an algorithm that doesn't have a model card attached to it, and that's not being repeatedly tested for disparate impact, right? That's a very real, achievable approach that has measurable benefits for human society. But you also need to acknowledge that, I'm looking right now at the image of judicious, unbiased, safe, and transparent on your Zoom card here, and judicious is important, but is also, if it's not a collective form of judiciousness, it is not actually judicious. There are Supreme Court justices in the United States right now who in recent days have declared war on half of the nation. So they are judicial. I'm not sure how judicious they are, right? Unbiased, I think, is maybe dangerously optimistic, because we have to acknowledge that there is no such thing as an unbiased data system. There are only data systems whose biases we understand and data systems whose biases we don't understand. Safe comes back to the question of safe for whom. I would argue period tracking apps were generally safe for American women in 2020, and they're unsafe for American women in 2024. And transparency also comes with its caveats. Most people don't have the technical or educational expertise to evaluate, even if an algorithm were completely transparent, to evaluate, what's going on in the coding and in the statistical methods that are being applied to data. And so ultimately that transparency presupposes that there has to be some kind of verification, certification, or expert class who are interpreting the the interiors of these data systems in a way that itself is reliable and transparent, and speaks to the needs of disparate populations that might intersect with those data systems. So none of this is to say that you shouldn't do it, but the point is, these are, I think, all of those terms that you used, all the FAIR acronym and the JUST acronym, are aspirational and directional and not absolute. Like, it's not an achievable goal, but that doesn't mean it isn't one that we should strive toward.
Fantastic. Okay, so You mentioned an immersion in science fiction culture, so I feel I'm on fairly safe ground here. I've long had this theory that the primary cultural movement of the 21st century is to resemble as closely as possible the science fiction of the 1980s. So let's talk about Blade Runner from the perspective of AI. I've got three related questions about this. One is, with AI, are we effectively reinventing and replicating slavery? The second question is, what does that say about us? And the third question is, what does that do to us?
Well, I mean, I think AI is not a monolithic topic, right? So there are certainly, from a conceptual standpoint, the idea of offloading labor, the movement of the reframing of intelligence. We were actually just talking about this the other day. Part of what is interesting to me about AI is that it represents, in its current form, being extremely data driven and data intensive. It is effectively, the pinnacle of empiricist thinking, right? In terms of that there is one route to knowledge. There is one route to producing actionable knowledge and inference from within that. The statistical basis of it, the questions of where intelligence is located, the topics of personhood, the participation in democratic processes, the participation of AI in the development of intellectual property, and authorship and ownership. We're destabilizing those notions. We cover a lot of that in the book. I think we're going to be dealing with the ramifications of this, but I think that we're going to be dealing also with the implications of the reinforcement and reification of the notion that the only route towards knowledge is through empirical experience and data-driven experience. It is quite dangerous for us as a society. And I think if we can balance that with a real investigation of the other routes to knowledge and and really try to find, again, I think some of this book is an attempt to bring that conversation back to, if you can't explain a topic of this kind in a way that the average person can have a gut level response, an intuitive response to this, then I think we're going, and obviously that needs to, we need to be in dialogue with each other. We need to, check our biases, as Aram's pointing out. But I do think that it's fascinating to see right now as we roll out so-called generative algorithms, and really to think of this as a mirror to ourselves, really to think of this as an opportunity for us to reflect on the data that we're feeding these algorithms that we have produced, and the sort of the frameworks we have around us, the bigger picture of expression of what we are really engaged in when we are building these so-called intelligences, that we have an opportunity for reflection. I'm not sure we're doing that enough, and I'm not sure that the people who are doing it at scale are the people who need to be the only people who need to be involved in that conversation with their particular theories of consciousness, and quest for immortality, famously singularity, contingent. I mean, we have to acknowledge that there is a culture that's being expressed here, and the culture that is being actualized and operationalized at scale through the massive application of capital. And I think that it's important that other perspectives are implicated in this quest, and that we are taking the time to adequately reflect on this. And I think that there are many researchers doing that, and far beyond what Aram and I are capable of summarizing, that are worth time and attention. But I'm not sure, again, that the framing of this specifically, as the Blade Runner, the Philip K. Dick story behind this, effectively the dramatization of a Turing test, is the only framework that we can apply when we're thinking about consciousness, particularly in this moment when we have so much evidence that there is such a broader conversation that needs to happen before we even get to that point.
Yeah, I'd say today in 2024, to the best of my knowledge, which is limited, slavery is not the framework that's most useful to understand the power dynamics. I would say exploitation. When you talk about what we call AI at the moment, when we talk about ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion or any of these other generative platforms, what their principal use case is what is classically known as exploitation, which means the production of profit on the back of labor that doesn't remunerate that labor adequately, and where the vast majority of the profit goes to the capital owner. In this case, the organization that runs and deploys the AI. So there, I think, I'm currently writing an article about this with some colleagues of mine, but I think there's a real disconnect between the language of intellectual property and the language of creative labor that leads a lot of us who are knowledgeable and sensitive to these subjects to kind of be squatting across this chasm, where on the one hand you don't want to over propertize expression, but on the other hand you don't want creative laborers to be any further exploited than it's already been. Where I would say it begins to verge into slavery territory is two different cases, both of which are really summarized in the language of the singularity that Jesse alluded to before. One is if artificial general intelligence becomes a real thing, and there are sentient non-human actors who don't have rights and autonomy. And the other is, I think, more likely to happen in the near future, which is the totalizing entrainment of the human sensorium and cognitive apparatus with digital prosthetics. Imagine Neuralink plus Meta plus whatever, to the point where there's no space for autonomy or independent thought for a human being enmeshed in these systems.
Interesting. Jesse, you mentioned gut level response. I'm going to give you mine. That there is a lot to like in your book. For something so terrifying, it's quite a fun read. But I think my favorite passage is the last paragraph, which I'm not going to read out, but I guess could be summarized as "don't panic." Now, we've got a lot of smart people in the room for the next 3 days. What can we actually do, and what should we be thinking about?
Well, I mean, again, I think the argument that I'm making here is that we need a blend. We need a blend of concrete actions. We need, first of all, to interrogate our own relationships to data, to data networks. We need to understand the explicit and implicit, opt-ins that we have been doing with respect to our behaviors and our business models. The ways that we communicate with others, everything down to, as Aram pointed out, just decisions made in the home. We need to take some account of our own relationship to these ideas and take some time, I think, as we did in the writing of this book, to really interrogate our own kind of blind spots with respect to, the larger project here. I think there's another aspect here which is important to address. So, while we talk about the abstraction of, there's no telling what will happen to the data, there are some very tangible things that are happening right now. For example, we have businesses, services that are being offered to us, which essentially their business models, they have the long game, right? They offer a service. They create a community, they create a subculture, they court, your participation and adoption of that. And then at a certain point, when they've reached scale with respect to the data that they've collected, they change the terms of service, right? And we've seen that, for example, with Tumblr and WordPress recently, where they've announced that all of the contributions that they've received over the last decade or more are now suddenly being used to train artificial intelligence algorithms without the consent of any of those participants. And so I really do think that we're going to see more and more of this happening. I think that this is a playbook we'll probably be listening to business case studies where they sort of define some type of critical mass of data collection that can be sold at a certain price in the marketplace, and particularly given the sort of parallel scaling of artificial intelligence with companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, all of these competing brands that are voraciously searching for data sets, that we're seeing more and more that this is a viable business model for a company that may not have had a clear path to profitability, as many startups were, that suddenly, oh, this is a gold mine for us. We're gonna, and I think that we as consumers need to push back on this. We need to understand and curate our participation within those platforms, but also just recognize that these particular norms can be changed, right? This is something which we as consumers can push back on, and we need to actually organize in that way. If we are starting ventures, if we are initiating products, I caught the very tail end of the presentation previous to ours. I think we need to build this conversation into the innovation process, right? We need to think clearly about what we are doing. We need to be honest with ourselves and with our customers about what that end game might be. And I think we need to, I would like to think that there are those of us who are actually actively seeking to opt out, right? And if you look at some of the alternate movements, like the whole Proton ecosystem with respect to data handling, data privacy, I mean, I think it's clear that it is possible to build systems. They may be more complex to build, but they are imbued with a certain set of values. And I think that we all also that care about these issues owe a duty of care to support them and to actually make them viable in the marketplace. Because I think that ultimately, without viable alternatives, there's going to be this sort of momentum towards this fate that many of us would rather say is possible to resist.
Aram, final word is yours.
Everything Jesse just said, plus one of the things that we asked every interviewee, and we interviewed about 30 people for this book formally and then many more informally, we would typically, ask these people to weigh in on these subjects that they have deep domain expertise in, better than, in some cases, anyone else on the planet. And at the end of our interview, we'd say, okay, knowing what you know, if you were a supervillain, what's the worst thing that you could possibly do with that knowledge to wreak maximum havoc in human society? And almost without exception, people would say, I never really thought about that. That's a good question. And they wouldn't have an adequate answer. And Jesse and I realized about halfway through researching the book that this was a major finding for us, is that the people who we have entrusted with building this data-saturated, globally networked social environment that we are all now compelled to participate in every waking moment, haven't really adequately thought about what could go wrong. I would combine that observation with another one that was most poignantly delivered by a disability rights activist and technological design scholar we interviewed, named Laura Furlano, whose work is phenomenal if you don't know it, who really clearly elucidated for us why every design process, and that includes the design of data systems, needs to center the most vulnerable users and include the most vulnerable potential users in the design process, because otherwise the disproportionate capacity for negative consequences that they will suffer won't be recognized until after the products have been deployed in the marketplace. So what I would say to anybody in the room who is a technology developer or for whom technological deployment is central to your business model is think constantly about what could go wrong, especially for the most vulnerable people in the world, and proceed from there.
Fantastic. Thank you both. I'm taking two main things away from this for me personally. One is the phrase digital kindness as a concept. I think that's a really lovely phrase. The other being that it's a good time to work on my supervillain origin story. But thank you so much, Aram Sinnreich and Jesse Gilbert, for being here. The book is called The Secret Life of Data. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, round of applause.